Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill is a sad reminder for Australians, a reminder that we have a government that has failed them, left them without a vaccination, left them stranded in dangerous and unsafe parts of the world. And without this bill, they would also be left without the financial support which they desperately need right now. That's why Labor does support this bill, but we know that there are huge concerns from the people who this bill affects. The people who are trapped because the government has failed to provide them with a vaccine, trapped because the government has failed to bring them home, deserve so much more from this government. We can't forget, as the member for Barton has said, that this government cut social security to the bone. It was Labor that gave the largest increase to the pension in more than a century. And over the last 8 years, we've seen the government try to cut the pension again and again and again. Cut, cut, cut. For more than 20 years, pensioners have been expected to rely on the fact that as prices rise, so should their pension. Always something that pensioners could rely on, but not under this government. This government tried to stop pensioners getting the support they need, freezing their pensions. And after pressure from Labor and the community and pensioners who don't mind standing up for themselves, because they know that this government won't stand up for them, the government capitulated and gave them 2 one-off payments. But it's part of a pattern of behaviour from the government when it comes to the pension. And so the pension payments that we provided to those stuck overseas are less than they would have been had Labor have not stood up against this government's mean cuts. Let's remember in 2014, it was the $80 cut from the pension with the removal of indexation, the $900 cut with the axing of the seniors supplement for self-funded retirees, and the $1 billion cut from pensioner concessions. That was just 2014 in the Abbott hockey horror budget. But they continued in 2015 because they actually believe in making life harder for pensioners who've worked their entire life and then, expecting a secure, stable retirement, have to worry about what's going to come in the budget from this government every year. We saw that by changing the assets test, the government cut as much as $12,000 a year for some 370,000 Australians. And that wasn't enough. In 2016, Deputy Speaker, they cut the pension to around 190,000 pensioners by limiting their travel period to 6 weeks and cut the pension for around 1.5 million pensioners by scrapping the energy supplement for new pensioners. On the government's own figures, 563,000 Australians would have been worse off. When it comes to this government and what they might cut, the reality is anything is possible. And after they've racked up $1 trillion of debt with no reform plan, I worry that pensioners will be first in the firing line again when this government snaps back to their cut, cut, cut approach to how they seek to manage the nation's finances. And the government also has a habit of denying things and then, a few weeks later, doing them. We've seen that in terms of and I worry, I guess, about the actions of what this government is seeking to do with some very odd language and very carefully chosen language by government ministers around the cashless pension card. The Cashless Welfare Card that has been trialled in a range of communities and has cost the government millions of dollars in its rollout is now being expanded. We know that the minister, quote, wants to make this mainstream. Making the Cashless Welfare Card, making the Cashless Pension Card mainstream will mean that pensioners lose the flexibility that they deserve, in their retirement. And pensioners are worried, so I bring the concerns of pensioners in my electorate into this House. And the minister has used some very careful language, and the government is so sensitive about this because they know that what they are doing, what they are discussing is wrong. It is disrespectful of pensioners. I've got no problem. This government has a problem with pensioners buying a beer. I've got no problem with pensioners buying a beer. They have worked hard, helped build this country, raised their families, and if the penalty that this government wants to put on pensioners for just trying to enjoy their retirement is restrict their ability to buy a beer or buy a glass of wine, it is absolutely disgraceful. It is garbage from this government. We know that older Australians are vulnerable. We know that when this government talks about expanding the cashless welfare card into a cashless pension card, it is something that is of concern to pensioners, and this government will now seek to expand this to also, and you think about it, think about a stranded pensioner overseas, the people we're trying to help with this legislation. Those pensioners, how does the cashless pension card work if you're stuck overseas? Can you use it in the UK? You wouldn't be able to. Can you use it if you're stuck in Indonesia? No. So there are huge rollout problems of the government's cashless pension card because they do have to approve the providers, and it's also a huge amount of red tape for businesses in my electorate. Any expansion of the cashless welfare card is a huge expansion of red tape for small businesses.
The member for Perth has the call.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a huge expansion of red tape for small businesses in my electorate, having to go through approvals process by this government, having to go through...
The member for Perth has the call and will be heard in silence.
And the minister at the table is proudly saying that he designed the damn card. I don't know. Like, most of us come here because you want to, change the nation. You want to build infrastructure. You want to make sure that you leave the next generation better off than the generation that came before. And instead, what this government is looking to do with expanding the cashless pension card is clearly something that they know they should be embarrassed about. And until the government can properly rule this out, and I quote the minister again.
Order. The member for Perth will be heard in silence. If members want to have a discussion, they can leave the chamber. But the member for Perth will be heard in silence.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And so, as long as the government says that they want to make the cashless welfare card and the cashless pension card mainstream, I will continue to bring the concerns of my community into this chamber, because that's my job, to make sure that we raise these concerns and make sure that the government doesn't continue down this path. Because my view is that pensioners have made sacrifices. We've all made sacrifices over the last year, but pensioners have done it tougher than most. Before the pandemic, they were making sacrifices. Research from the government's own, that the government commissioned after they started cutting the pension, shows this. We had research that showed that a third of Australian pensioners are experiencing energy poverty. Energy costs have been a major concern for older Australians. Many pensioners spend a substantial portion of their income on power bills. And when this pandemic hit, it showed just how vulnerable pensioners were. And can I congratulate the McGowan Labor government in Western Australia, who saw that vulnerability and sought to provide a $600 credit to pensioners in my electorate so they could continue to pay their power bills. Something that made sure that where the income supports that were being provided to pensioners during the pandemic weren't sufficient, the state stepped in. And that's sort of a pattern of behaviour that we see time and time again. The other thing that's important to note is that it's also pensioners and senior Australians who raise concerns about the lack of affordable renewable energy in our grid. They know that, that for their long-term, and pensioners are people who do that long-term planning. They don't just think about how much money we're going to have this month or next month. They're thinking about the rest of their lives, 20 years. And they know that the only way that over that 20 years they're going to have lower power bills and the energy they need to run their houses, keep them warm, is to make sure that we start that important transition towards renewable energy. Because otherwise, it's just going to be the same pattern that we've seen for the last 8 years under this government. 50% increase in power bills, pensioners choosing to have cold showers, not putting the heating on at night, not being able to afford to run their air conditioners during heat waves, as we experience in Perth on a regular basis. And I come to the people that we're trying to help in terms of those who are stuck overseas. As of May 28, it's 35,000 Australians who want to get home but can't. Many of them are older Australians. 4,260 of them are classified as vulnerable Australians. And so while we are passing this legislation to help them with financial support I'd much rather that we weren't having this debate, because sometime we actually, if the government and the Prime Minister had delivered on his promise to get everyone home by Christmas last year, this legislation wouldn't be necessary. Right. Simple as that. We wouldn't need it. We need this legislation because 6 months on, it's another broken promise from this Prime Minister. And we know in India alone, there are more than 11,000 Australians who are trying to get home. Some of them grandparents who haven't seen their grandkids for more than a year. Families separated by the incompetence and laziness of this government. And the Prime Minister promised, he promised to the Australian people in the middle of a pandemic that he would get these pensioners home. He would bring them home. Having broken that promise, we finally have some legislation to at least provide them with their pension payments. And this is the same Prime Minister who assures us that he is on a war footing, that we are on a war footing in terms of how we're helping people.
Get to the front bench. Stop it with the personal insults, Alan. I don't want to start that.
I do wonder. We get questions from time to time. People say, "Oh, how do different people get to the front bench?" And I just ask the people, the government opposite, how do you leave the Prime Minister in his job when he has continued to lie and fail the Australian people? He promised...
Order. The member for Perth will withdraw that.
I withdraw, Deputy Speaker.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister said we are on a war footing. But apparently this doesn't apply to the vaccine rollout or quarantine. If it did, we would be making proper use of our defence assets. If Labor was in government, we'd look at things like the RAAF base at Learmonth as a priority to make sure that we can have the capacity to get these pensioners home. So we don't have to send their cashless pension cards and their payments overseas. We instead can just bring them home. And that also means they're spending their pension here in Australia, supporting Australian small businesses. But quarantine, despite being a Commonwealth responsibility, is not a priority, even though pensioners time and time again stuck overseas are saying, we want to come home. We want to get back to where we grew up, where we worked our lives, where we want to see our families and our grandkids. We know that the Holton report recommended a purpose-built facility in Western Australia. But because this government is so stubborn and so determined to ignore the expert advice, our nation is stuck. Premier McGowan has said very clearly that he would like to see, quote, a facility next to an international capacity airport. It's been suggested that Exmouth or Busselton could be the location, but, and I quote him, there's those sort of places that are outside of the heavily populated inner city of Perth, but the Commonwealth shows no appetite, end quote. The Commonwealth shows no appetite. And I just can't understand it, why you would choose to leave the most dangerous bits of quarantine in the middle of our CBD after we've had so many pieces of evidence that doesn't work. I know that what that means to the pensioners who live in my electorate, that they are left vulnerable to these quarantine leaks, which we see time and time again. They haven't had their full vaccination schedule. The information coming out of this government is light to non-existent at best, although I understand that every pensioner in my electorate next month will receive a personalised letter from the Prime Minister telling them about the vaccine schedule and why they should get it. When pensioners need a vaccine and the government's solution is to give them a letter from the Prime Minister, I think that just shows how badly the rollout of the vaccination schedule has been. And the government has failed when it comes to the confidence that is needed in the vaccine rollout. This is a huge problem that this government fails to address. I mean, it's great that we've got this legislation that is very important for a very small number of people, but I'd also expect that the government does something for the very large number of people who are waiting, and for them to actually step up on the two jobs that they should be focusing on day in, day out.
Totally.
Quarantine and vaccines. If you get quarantine right, you get vaccines right, we don't need legislation like this. We can bring the pensioners home who are stuck overseas. We can make sure they're spending that money here in Australia and reconnect Australian families who have been stuck apart for more than a year because of the incompetence of this government. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.